So, brothers and sisters in the Dhamma, Namo Buddhaya, Jai Bhim. I'm sitting here in the Padmaloka shrine room in front of the west wall, which is, as you can see behind me, the main figure is the great Buddha of the Western direction, Amitabha, the Buddha of infinite light. And I'm giving a talk to some members of the Padmaloka community. But this talk goes out to our friends in Brixton, the Brixton Sangha. I think you call it the Brixton Buddhist Centre. So this is for you, and this is particularly for your Vaishaka Purnima celebrations, your Buddha Day celebrations. Vaishaka Purnima being the full moon of Vaishak, the traditional day on which the Buddha gained supreme and perfect enlightenment, or supreme and perfect awakening. And as I speak, I'm bringing to mind, as well as my friends in the Padmaloka community who are here in the shrine room, I'm bringing to mind visits to the Brixton Centre, the Brixton Sangha, in that I don't know if you're still meeting there, but we used to go to that yoga centre, and I gave talks in that wonderful kind of almost attic-like space, very, very intimate space. And I have incredibly fond memories of my evenings in Brixton speaking on the Dhamma, particularly in the summertime when it was very, very hot. And I really enjoyed the intimacy and the warmth and the intensity of the evening. So I've got, my friends in Brixton in mind, and this is a talk for you. And I've given the talk a title, An Abundance of Lotuses, and that title will become clear as we go along. I've been asked to speak for half an hour, and I'm notorious for, speaking for very long periods. So this might have to be an edited talk, might need to be edited down, but I'll leave that to you. So we're in this it's not just a very strange period, but it's also a very tragic period, a very poignant period, a very painful period, a very demanding period for human beings across the world. And we're in this period where where our governments are asking us, telling us, ordering us to be in isolation, to be in seclusion, to be away from one another because of the transmission of this disease, which is killing people and overwhelming the world that we're in. And I know for many people this is a very, very difficult time. It's very, very demanding on their resources, their human resources, having to look after family and having to keep their job going, or if not, sometimes being furloughed and not being able to work at all, and not being able to get out very much. So it's very, very difficult for people. And I know that some of you in Brixton are also working in care professions, and you're having to face very demanding and difficult circumstances where you're caring for the vulnerable and people in real difficulties. So what can one say? It's very painful to sort of see that, to hear about that, and yet here at Padmaloka we are in idyllic conditions. We're in very, very beautiful conditions. There's 18 of us living more or less like monks in a perfect retreat environment. So the notion for us of isolation and seclusion is actually very positive. It's positive even though there is this terrible shadow, over the whole world that we keep aware of, and we like to keep aware of. Actually here, in our environment, we are in perfect conditions for Buddhist practice. Of course, it doesn't mean that we're in perfect mental states all the time. I think being now about a month in lockdown, in seclusion, it kind of brings up, tricky things, which some of you would probably smile at, who are having to, look after your children and loved ones, and, as I say, being involved in the caring professions. And we can, even in these perfect conditions, we can make a bit of a meal of our mental states, if you like, which is, perhaps not the best response to things. Generally, though, we're in pretty positive and skillful states of mind. And it's interesting to reflect on this notion of seclusion, of isolation, because there is a traditional Buddhist word called Vivica. It's used a lot in Buddhist texts, and it means removing yourself from the affairs of daily life, going into retreat, removing yourself from that. And we find the word used at the time of the Buddha's enlightenment itself. You find in many descriptions of the Buddha's enlightenment, it says that he was secluded. He was away in retreat. He was in the forest. He was beneath what became called the Bodhi tree by the river Naranjara, away from things. Yes, there were villages nearby for alms food, but he was away from things. He was quite apart from things. He wasn't just apart from things physically. There's another kind of viveka, which is the sort of withdrawal, if you like, from the withdrawal from the heart, from involvement in unskillful, negative mental states, and completely being occupied with the skillful, particularly the higher levels of meditation, what we call the jhanas in Pali, the dhyanas in Sanskrit, these higher absorptions. So you've got this sort of progression of viveka. You withdraw from the hurly-burly of life, and you withdraw from the material world, as it were. You withdraw from the usual distractions. And then you withdraw your heart from being bound up with unskillfulness, with greed and hatred and delusion and conceit and fear and all those very negative states of mind and distraction and so on. And you just become more and more absorbed in what is truly meaningful, in more and more absorbed in loving kindness, in awareness, in states of concentration. And there's an unfolding of consciousness. So this is very, very important. And, we find descriptions of the Buddha's journey to enlightenment when he'd discovered the way, had this intuition about the way forward, of him just being absorbed in deeper and deeper meditation, supremely contented, but moving on to see deeply into the nature of things and find that liberating truth that we call enlightenment. And there are many descriptions of this, and I'm sure on your in Brixton on your Buddha Day celebrations, you'll be exploring this in greater detail. But I'm not going to go into the nature of the Buddha's enlightenment right now. I might sort of touch on it as we go on. But there's a whole kind of unfolding of, for want of a better word, experiences that the Buddha has. You find him, for example, for 7 days after his attainment of enlightenment, 7 days sitting in meditation without moving, enjoying, the text says, enjoying the bliss of liberation, the vimutti sukha, the bliss of liberation. And I think this is a very expressive way of describing the Buddha's enlightenment, this tremendous absorption in bliss, in satisfaction, and that is born of complete liberation. It's a very, very important way of describing the Buddha's attainment of enlightenment, is complete liberation from all negative emotion, greed, hatred, and so on, and liberation from complete confusion and ignorance, and the entry into this completely unbounded state, if you can call it that, because a state sounds something bounded, this unbounded something, which we call enlightenment. Sometimes it's described, that enlightenment, as the dawning of a great light. The word is aloka, a great light, which also can mean a very clear picture, because the Buddha has a very clear picture and vision of the way things are. It's described as the opening of the eye. The eye, the Buddha just sees with the eye the way things are, the eye of reality, if you like, because there's no difference between the seeing and what's seen. It's just this dawning of reality. So you get all these different terms. Sangharakshita, our teacher, has reflected very, very deeply on the different accounts of the Buddha's enlightenment. And in a very early one, a seminar he did on an early collection called the Udana, which begins with stories of the Buddha's enlightenment. His commentary on this, being asked about sitting for 7 days, many multiples of 7 days, without moving, he said it's as if after enlightenment, there's a very, very deep absorption, because that enlightenment isn't seen with any kind of ordinary mind. It's beyond all conception. He was even tried to sort of give a glimpse of what was seen. He said it's as if the whole of the Buddha's life had just gone over the edge, as it were, over the edge of the precipice. And like the stream of his being had just gone over the edge. And there's just this one flash, a flash in a sense out of time, in which there is seen the nature of things. And then there is a period of deep absorption in that. An absorption which begins to see how can that direct experience of things be turned into language, be turned into words so that it can be understood, so that it can be communicated, so it can be lived out for the benefit of all. And there's a very, very important moment in this unfolding sequence of things in the Buddha's enlightenment, where we find the Buddha deeply meditating. It's presented as a sort of set of reflections, but I think we have to sort of imagine it's not just any ordinary thought. This is a sort of deep meditation. It goes like this. This Dhamma, which Dhamma usually means the Buddha's teachings. Here, it means reality, the way things are. This Dhamma, this truth that I have attained is profound. The word in Pali is gambhira, which just means deep. It's profound, it's deep. It's the deepest possible thing, actually. It's deeper than deep, if you like. This Dhamma that I have attained is profound. It's hard to see and hard to understand. It's not an easy thing. Sometimes people like to present Buddhism as though it's really sort of easy to get, really sort of straightforward. And in a sense, it is, but at its deepest level, it's not easy. And beware flip presentations of Buddhism. You're dealing with the most profound of the profound, which is hard to see and hard to understand. He then reflected that this Dhamma is peaceful. Shanta in Sanskrit. It's peaceful. This isn't any kind of ordinary peace. It isn't the sort of peace where you just say to somebody, "Oh, leave me in peace," because things are too much. This is the deepest possible peace. You perhaps get a feeling for the end of our sevenfold puja after the mantras, and we have the Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. And there's that deep peace that can open up if you've really done the puja properly. And this mantra is said to be the pacification. It's the mantra, in a way, pointing to this peace of nirvana, the complete pacification of craving, hatred and delusion, even at their sort of subtlest level. So this deep, deep peace. It's peaceful. and sublime. Sublime, the Buddha says. It's sublime. It's, really quite beyond what we usually think about, how we usually conceive things. There's a sense of awe that one would have in relation to the Dhamma if you've realised it properly. So it's sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, a Padmavajra, or a better translation, beyond the sphere, the reach of reasoning. This is very, very important. Sometimes we think we've mastered Buddhism because we understand it intellectually, but the Buddha's enlightenment is beyond thinking. It's beyond thought. There's no thought involved in the Buddha's enlightenment. It's beyond all reason. It's beyond ratiocination. It's beyond any kind of conception whatsoever. It's subtle, the Buddha reflected. Subtle. Very, very subtle. Very, very subtle. You've got to be very, very attuned to intuit the Dhamma, to be experienced by the words, by the wise. This word experienced is not perhaps the best translation. It's Vedanio in Pali, and Vedanio means something like it's to be intuited by the wise. Experience implies you're sort of getting something. It's something intuited. The Buddha also uses the word rasa to describe in other places, to describe his enlightenment. The taste. It has a tasting. It's direct. Veda can also mean feeling. That can be misunderstood, but I think you're getting perhaps the sense of what the Buddha is trying to get at. So he reflects in this way that this Dhamma is that he's attained to is profound, it's hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful, it's sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle, to be felt, to be tasted by the wise, by those who know. And then he reflects on the world he's in. He reflects, but this generation, by this generation it means all of us, that which is born, that which comes into being. This generation delights in worldliness. The word for worldliness is alia, and it means here not just our worldly attitudes, our materialistic attitudes, our grasping attitudes, but also the things that we grab hold of as well. It's both inside and outside. This generation delights in worldliness, takes delight in worldliness, rejoices in worldliness. It's interesting, we have this word in Buddhism, don't we? The samsara, the wheel of life, conditioned existence, and you know how difficult the samsara is. And we're sort of feeling that very strongly at the moment with this present crisis. Samsara. But we are samsara. That's the point. We're not in it, we are it. We take delight in worldliness. We rejoice in worldliness, in our reactive, if you like, attitudes and all the things that goes with that. And he goes further. It's hard for such a generation to see this truth, to see the truth, namely specific conditionality, conditioned co-production. So this is really, really crucial. The great sort of doctrine, for want of a better word, the sort of essential description of what the Buddha actually saw, the way he describes it is in terms of this principle of conditioned co-production. It's a very clunky sounding word, not a very poetic phrase at all. Pratitya samutpada in Sanskrit, paticca samuppada in Pali. And Sangharakshita, he said the difficulty with these old Pali texts, it can all sound very worked out, but he said it's beyond reason. So he believed that what really happened, if you like, at the Buddha's enlightenment, there was this great flowing over the edge into something completely open. And what was seen in one flash was the arising and the passing away of the whole of life. And that arising and passing away came about through the arising of particular conditions that give rise to further conditions that give rise to other conditions. And all of that is bound up in craving and delusion, which leads to suffering. But it's a vision, a direct vision, a completely liberating vision in the Buddha's case, because what he sees through is all of those conditions which have led to his continual going round and round the toil and strife of the wheel of life, of samsara. And the Buddha goes, so this is the truth that's very hard for us to see. We can read all the words about it, listen to talks about it, but we don't feel liberated through hearing it. And he goes further, and it is hard to see this truth, namely the stilling of all formations, the stilling of all conditions, the renouncing of all grasping, the destruction of craving, dispassion, cessation, nirvana. So this is the Buddha's description of nirvana as the complete ending, the complete liberation from all of the strife and stress and suffering that comes out of our craving and grasping and unknowing. That's what he's saying is so difficult for people to get. And then he goes further. If I were to teach the Dhamma, and teach is Dhammadesana, which means more like communicate, show, reveal this truth, others would not understand me, and that would be wearying and troublesome for me. And then he breaks into verse. Enough with teaching the Dhamma, that even I found hard to reach, for it will never be perceived by those who live in lust and hate. Those died in lust, wrapped in darkness, will never discern this abstruse truth, which goes against the worldly stream, subtle, deep, and difficult to see. Considering thus, my mind inclined to inaction or reluctance rather than teaching the Dhamma, making known the truth. Well, there's an extraordinary kind of moment in Buddhist history. The Buddha's had this liberating vision. He's completely liberated. He's enjoying the bliss of liberation that's very, very subtle. And then he kind of brings to mind others. And he just has this sense, this deep realization, they will not see it. And that will be wearying and troublesome to me if they don't see it. It can be a bit of a difficult one, this, because we sort of think that Buddha, surely he'll never be wearied or troubled. That's impossible. And unfortunately, it's. I think that attitude can be a bit more to do with our expectation that other people should be perfect and give us everything that we need. The thought that the Buddha has reached a place where it's going to be highly problematic to communicate that truth. This can be very difficult for people to accept, but we need to look at our own mundane human experience, our ordinary experience. You sometimes have that experience, don't you, where something much deeper that you've realised and understood, which is very precious to you, is there. You know, it's in your mind, and you're really desperate to communicate it. You want other people to know it, and you try. They're not interested. They're indifferent, or they react to it, or they, like I say, a lot of the time they just don't care about it. That's very, very painful. It's very, very painful, and after a while you think, well, why bother? Why bother trying to communicate these things? I've known people come along to Buddhism, generally, and the relief that they feel that they can communicate about deep matters is palpable. They say, I've never been able to communicate like this. Trying to communicate like this, even to people who I've been closest to in my family or old friends, I've never been understood. It's very, very painful. Well, on a much, much higher sublime level, this is what the Buddha is getting at. The Buddha is transcendent. In a way, what's being depicted here is the complete transcendence of the Buddha's realization. It's trying to give us a feeling for the otherness, if you like, of enlightenment. Again, there can be a way in which we try to just incorporate enlightenment into our worldly attitudes, incorporate the Dhamma into our life so that it makes us feel more comfortable. Well, this particular moment in Buddhist history is showing, no. The Dhamma, the truth of the Buddha, is of a different order entirely. And in a sense, there's nothing to keep the Buddha with us. There's nothing in him, as it were, to keep him with us. He's so beyond, so altogether out and beyond our way of looking at things, our way of seeing things. There's nothing to keep him. He's way, way out there, way beyond. And it's very, very important to meditate on that, to really meditate on that, to really reflect upon that. This is why we have these stories. So he's sitting there, reluctant, meditating. And then the ancient texts say, and this is the Buddha actually describing this, because he's telling his life story to his disciples. He said, then Brahma Sahampati knew with his mind the thought in my mind, and he considered, the world will be lost, the world will perish, since the mind of the Tathagata, accomplished and fully enlightened, inclines to inaction rather than to communicating the Dhamma. Then just as quickly as a strong man might extend his flexed arm or flex his extended arm, I like that image in the Pali text, Brahma Sampati vanished from the Brahma world and appeared before me. He arranged his upper robe on one shoulder and extended his hands in reverential salutation towards me. So a little bit about Brahma Sahampati. So Brahma Sahampati is a god. He's a god with a particular interest. He's not enlightened. He's not a creator god. This is very hard for us to understand, but in Indian tradition, in the tradition of the Buddha and his disciples, in traditional Buddhist cosmology, you have these higher heavenly realms, so to speak, inhabited by these devas. And the Brahmas, there are many different kinds of Brahmas, are very, very elevated indeed. And Brahma Sahampati is right out there at the most refined of levels of consciousness, corresponding to different dhyana levels. And he has a particular interest, he has a particular concern. He feels a concern for the whole of life. He can't teach, he can't sort of teach Buddhism or anything like that. He doesn't know the truth, but he knows what the world needs. So he has this sense of responsibility, and he knows that the Buddha's teaching is going to improve people's lives, it's going to lead to liberation, and without it, people will perish. People will decline. The world will decline. And Brahma doesn't want that. He seems to have some compassion, some responsibility. So he vanishes from his realm and comes to the Buddha, and he salutes the Buddha. He regards the Buddha as greater than him. The Buddha is known as the Saturday the Medusa, the teacher of gods and men. He's transcended even these higher heavenly realms. And he says this, Bhante, Venerable Sir, Let the Blessed One teach the Dhamma. Let the Happy One, the Sugata, teach the Dhamma. There are beings with little dust in their eyes who are wasting through not hearing the Dhamma. There will be those who will understand the Dhamma. And then he breaks into verse. In Magadha, that's the region in which the Buddha is, there has appeared till now impure teachings devised by those still stained. Open the doors to the deathless. Let them hear the Dhamma that the stainless one has found. Just as one stands on a mountain peak, can see below the people all around, so, O wise one, all-seeing sage, ascend the palace of the Dhamma. Let the sorrowless one survey this human realm, engulfed in sorrow, overcome by birth and old age. Arise, victorious hero, caravan leader, debtless one, and wander in the world. Let the Blessed One teach the Dhamma. There will be those who will understand. So this is one of the great sort of passages in Buddhist literature. This great God, this great being, entreating, begging, pleading with the Buddha to teach out of compassion, out of love. There will be people who will see. He sort of knows that the Buddha, has had this deep meditation that people will not get it. And that will be painful if they don't get it. Brahma knows that there will be people who get it. So he begs him to teach because people are wasting. They're wasting, they're perishing through not hearing the Dhamma. And again, that word wasting, perishing, I've had the experience of, people telling me their life stories and, how they felt that they were really in decline through not finding the Dhamma and that their life was wasting away, that they were, as it were, decaying, and how the Dhamma has given them life, how Buddhism has given them life and energy, something very deeply meaningful to live by that is, in relation to reality, in relation to the way things are. So this is an extraordinary moment, but what are we to make of it? Sometimes when people reflect upon this, they say, well, in a sense, it's describing a whole process in the Buddha's unfolding enlightenment. This is the arising of compassion. Brahma isn't really outside of the Buddha's mind. This is the emerging of compassion and love for others. It could be that. It could be that. It's interesting that Brahma sees with his mind the Buddha's mind. Brahma is at a sort of slightly lower, at a much lower level of consciousness from the Buddha. He's in the Brahmalokas, which are states of great loving kindness and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity. It's the abode of all that, and perhaps it's the emerging of those qualities in the Buddha's mind. Not that they weren't already there, actually. I'll come to that in a moment. Or it's telling us something about us. I said earlier that it can be quite shocking to think that the Buddha doesn't feel he can teach. It will be wearying. It will be painful. It will be vexing. It will just be such a drag to communicate and people not getting it. Well, what does that say about us? What we need to do is to get into a state of entreaty and supplication. We have this in the Sevenfold Puja, don't we? In the Sevenfold Puja, what is really going on in the Sevenfold Puja? We're enacting Brahma's request. That's what we're really doing at that stage in the puja. You could say the whole of the puja is getting us into a state of alert receptivity. I don't want to just use the word receptivity because so often the way people talk about receptivity, it sounds terribly passive and very passive in a way to their own experience. Entreaty and supplication, this urgent, open, alert state is when you recognize that you deeply need the Dhamma. You deeply need to come into contact with the Buddha. You deeply need to come into contact with something greater than you. You're definitely looking up. You're not coming along with lots of conceit and thinking you know it all. That's gone through the other stages of the puja. You're profoundly open and receptive. You want to learn. You need the teaching. When I think of my visits to Sangharakshita, sometimes I'd go away disappointed. I didn't feel I'd had a good communication. Sometimes I'd go and I really felt given something very, very profound. Looking back, it was entirely to do with my mental state. If I went to Bhante, to Sangharakshita, in a state of really wanting help, really needing something deeply, and really open to whatever he said, then I would really listen, I would really hear. If I went feeling already full, and that, it was just a bit of chit-chat or something like that, or just trying to show how intelligent I was and how developed I was, not interested. I'd get something. I'd for sure get something, because Bhante is a very, very wise man. But I'd learn so much more when there was that quality of entreaty and supplication. So we need to get into that state, that mood, all the time, actually. It's interesting, in the puja, after the entreaty and supplication, we have a Dhamma reading, and we have the Heart Sutra. At that point, we should get to that point in the puja, and we're really listening. We're really taking in the Buddha Vachana, as it's called, the word of the Buddha, and it goes in directly. So in a way, Brahma Sahampati's request is something we have to continually enact in relation to the Buddha. And you find in Buddhist literature, very, very strong verses of entreaty and supplication. There is a wonderful verse from the Sutra of Golden Light, sung by a goddess named Bodhisattva Samuchaya, the goddess who is the collection of all bodhisattva qualities. And she sings this paean of longing and entreaty to the Buddha, really wanting to hear what the Buddha has to say, really wanting the Buddha to appear, to be with her. So the Buddha needs to be entreated. We need to entreat. And then what happened? The Buddha responded. So something, some being, some consciousness in, if you like, conditioned existence in the samsara is calling out. So his enlightenment, his enlightened quality looks again. So he says, then I listened. The Buddha is open. I listened to Brahma's pleading. And out of compassion, karuna, out of compassion for beings, I surveyed the world with the eye of a Buddha. This is very interesting. It's not an ordinary eye. It's not a sort of philosophical eye. It's not a psychic eye. It's not any kind of mundane eye. It's his enlightenment looking at us, looking at all beings, taking in everything, everybody. So he's surveying the world with the eye of a Buddha. I saw beings with little dust in their eyes and with much dust in their eyes, with keen faculties and with dull faculties, with good qualities and with bad qualities, easy to teach and hard to teach, and some who dwelt seeing danger in this world and wanting to live for the world beyond, in other words, for enlightenment. Just as in a pond of blue or red or white lotuses, some lotuses that are born and grow in the water thrive immersed in the water without rising up out of it. And some other lotuses that are born and grow in the water rest on the water's surface. And some other lotuses that are born and grow in the water rise up out of the water and stand clear, unwetted by it. So too, surveying the world with the eye of a Buddha, I saw beings with little dust in their eyes, with much dust in their eyes, with keen faculties and with dull faculties, with good qualities and with bad qualities, easy to teach and hard to teach, and so on. And then I replied to Brahma Sahampati in a verse, open for them are the doors to the deathless. Let those with ears now release their faith. Thinking it would be troublesome, O Brahma, I did not speak the Dhamma, subtle and sublime. And Brahma is very pleased. He's very, very happy, and he leaves the Buddha then, feeling that he's really done something good in treating the Buddha to teach, and the Buddha has responded. But this moment where the Buddha surveys the whole world, all beings, us, and seeing us in all sorts of stages of development, all sorts of stages of growth, as being like, it's interesting, he uses poetry, he uses metaphor, he uses vision to describe something which is beyond really all language. He sees us all as being like lotuses, white lotuses, utpalas, red lotuses, padmas, white lotuses, pundarikas. They've got different names for these lotuses in Indian language. He sees us all as these different coloured lotuses growing up out of a great lake. Some are stuck in the mud, some are emerging, some are standing clear. It's a tremendous vision of growth. I talked earlier about the transcendence of the Buddha's enlightenment, and it could sound a bit negative, all that stilling of formations and nirvana and cessation. Here's the other side. Here is the vision that there is positive growth towards complete liberation. This is represented by that wonderful vision of all of us being like lotuses growing in a great lake, growing up out of the mud. It's one of the most treasured visions in Buddhist tradition. You know, really the way I suppose I see it, because he's seeing it with the Buddha eye, it's the Buddha's full enlightenment, if you like, the fully open 1,000-petaled lotus of the Buddha's enlightenment resonating with the emerging enlightenment in us little lotuses, coming up out of the mud, growing towards the light of enlightenment. And it's interesting that straight after this vision, the Buddha immediately leaves the Bodhi tree. He immediately leaves the Vajrasana, the place of enlightenment. He immediately starts to find people to communicate his Dhamma to the truth. There's no separation after that vision, after seeing. It's then just a life of continual communication with anybody. I mean, the first people he finds to teach are his old friends, the ascetics, who'd rejected him very, very negatively. You know, but he doesn't think about how negative they were to him. He's not interested in that. What he's interested in is that they can grow. He sees that emerging lotus of growth, of faith, that response to the truth. That's all he's interested in. All he's interested in is the deepest part of those people, and he wants to show them and teach them the way to enlightenment. And you also see in the Buddha's life how he starts to articulate that path of positive growth. He even sees the Praticca Samutpada as a whole sequence of stages and states unfolding, building up in the direction of enlightenment. He describes the Dhamma in those terms. So this is, really very, very important that we have this sense that the Buddha's enlightenment isn't just about one man becoming liberated. It's about the whole of life becoming liberated. That potential is possible for all of us, for everyone to emerge out of the swamp, out of the mud. And you know, lotuses grow in very, very muddy places, really disgusting places. I remember in India, when I lived in India, I remember going on a walk once in the mountains around Pune, very early days, and I went by this really, really black pond. Just turned a corner, I was right, this really black, viscous pond. It was almost sort of oily mud, stinky mud. But it wasn't just that, because coming out of this were these gorgeous, heavenly, pink, deep pink lotus flowers emerging out of the blackness. So it completely transfigured the whole scene. I know sometimes, you know, people believe that they're particularly sort of in particular difficulties, and they're a particularly sort of difficult person with all sorts of problems and difficulties. But lotuses grow in the most difficult places. So we shouldn't be concerned about that, because whatever our state, whatever our situation, we can emerge. We can emerge up out of that. You know, it's interesting, after the Buddha communicated his Dhamma to his 5 old ascetic friends, the next people he communicated to were the playboys near Sarnath, of the city of Benares, you know, merchant sons, who were in a real mess, some of them, Yasha particularly, you know, a real mess. He's just completely bored out of his skull with his life of continual self-indulgence, you know, listening to music all the time from his girlfriends or his courtesans, being fed all the delicacies, you know, that were around, you know, by his parents, you know, having his own special palaces and conveyances, no doubt wearing the best gear available. And of course he just reaches this point of utter ennui, utter kind of indifference, boredom, and realizing this is absolutely horrible. Bhayanka in Marathi. This is terrible. It's terrible. Awful. This sort of hell of indulgence. He stumbles across the Buddha, and the Buddha communicates with him, and he gets it. He gets the Dhamma like that immediately. Again, the Buddha's not interested where we come from, what our background is. The Dhamma's not interested in that. Our Triratna Buddhist community shouldn't be interested in that. As long as you come, because you are searching, you want to lift up out of the mud. So we need to all join in being part of this abundance of red and white and blue and pink and whatever colour you like, lotuses emerging out of the mud. This is what the Buddha's enlightenment is really communicating to us, that we can emerge out of things. There's a wonderful sutra. This image of the lotus becomes so important in Buddhist tradition over the years. It becomes more and more important as a teaching. So there's a sutra called the Vimalakirti Nirdesha, and then this is a Mahayana sutra, and it really goes into this business of ordinary people, wretched people, people like you and me, people in difficulty. People who might be really together, but actually they're still in difficulty, even though they think they're really together. And Vimalakirti explains, yes, they can follow the Bodhisattva path. They can follow the path to enlightenment. This is what he says. He sort of starts by talking about people who are quite saintly. They're quite saintly in their approach to things. So this is Manjushri actually talking, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, to Vimalakirti. Noble sir, one who stays in the fixed determination of the vision of the uncreated is not capable of arousing the urge to enlightenment for all beings. Very interesting. However, one who lives among created things in the minds of passions, without seeing any truth, is indeed capable of arousing the urge to enlightenment for all beings. Noble sir, flowers like the blue lotus, the red lotus, the white lotus, the water lily, and the moon lily do not grow on the dry ground in the wilderness, but do grow in the swamps and mud banks. Just so the qualities of the Buddha do not grow in living beings certainly destined for the uncreated, but do grow in those living beings who are like swamps and mud banks of passion. Likewise, as seeds do not grow in the sky, but do grow in the earth, so the qualities of a Buddha do not grow in those determined for the absolute, but do grow in those who arouse the urge to enlightenment, even though they have a view of themselves as fixed and unchanging as the King of Mountains. It's a really interesting passage, but I particularly like this language. Doesn't matter what you think about yourself, what you feel about yourself. If you feel that you're very muddy and swampy and so on, you can still grow in direction of enlightenment. You can develop all the Buddha's qualities. So on this celebration of Vaishaka Purnima, the full moon of Vaishak, Buddha Day, the celebration of the Buddha's enlightenment, let's remember this great vision of lotuses, this emerging of lotuses. Let's remember too the sublimity of the Buddha's teaching. We have to kind of hold, if you like, both ends of this story, the transcendence of the Buddha's enlightenment, that it's way, way out there, way beyond us, and we can emerge in the direction of that enlightenment. Both are true, and we have to hold both. So thank you very much for listening. This is much longer than half an hour, but it's an abundance of lotuses. Thank you.